Hey everybody, welcome to the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Kanakis, and I'm so glad you were able to join us this evening. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Azure Functions, automation, event automation using Event Grid, and all kinds of wonderful stuff with PowerShell and Azure. And we're super excited to be welcoming in our guest speaker tonight, Mr. Travis Roberts. How are you, Travis?
I'm doing great.
So let me also welcome in my co-host, Phil. How's it going, man?
I'm doing well. I'm super excited to even see this event grid topic. It's an interesting topic to me. But I also want to get a feel for Travis overall. Like, kind of where did you start, and getting a little cloud behind you. Are you a cloud guy, or did you start from other places?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in IT for approaching 25 years, and help desk, system administrator, manager. About, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, I actually was a cloud skeptic when it started, because over the course of my career, I've heard so many buzzwords that were really just marketing terms, and there wasn't technology behind it, and that's kind of the way I thought cloud was. But I saw the technology eventually and realized that it was a thing. And the way I described it at the time is at one point we used to install an OS on a piece of hardware and then put an application on that. And then virtualization came, and we started out saying, can that be virtualized? And we got to the point where now you have to make a case to not virtualize something. And I see that as the direction the cloud's going. We're asking that question, can it go into the cloud? And I think soon it's going to be, why do we have to have it on premises? So I got started with Azure primarily because that's the licensing options the company I was with had. But I started with a remote desktop service deployment in Azure, and I wanted to be able to scale out the session host kind of on demand, and that seemed like a good place for it. That was actually, timing-wise, that was when the Super Bowl was in Minnesota, and I can't remember what year that was, but I remember that because I was told I have to be able to accommodate the entire office because they're in downtown Minneapolis. If we can't get into the office, they need to be able to remote in. So that's kind of the quick overview of how I got here.
Cool. So I have a question for you. So I was thinking about this earlier today. So the title of our meeting tonight is automating Azure tasks with Event Grid and Azure Functions. And for someone that's maybe not well versed in that area, that probably seems like, whoa, that seems super complex. I don't think I could ever do that. How can someone sort of get themselves on a way to being able to do the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight? Like, how do they get started getting to what we're going to be at tonight?
I think a good spot is with Azure Automation or Azure Functions. And I have some detail on what the difference is and why you choose one over the other. But really, there's two big parts to this. One is Event Grid, and the other one is the Azure Functions. And you can run the Azure Functions without the Event Grid, and that's part of the half of this is going to be setting up that Azure Function to run with PowerShell.
Mm-hmm. And Azure Functions may sound, sort of an unknown area to a lot of people, but it's just another piece of code that people have learned, like PowerShell. As you get better at it, you start to build blocks of code to automate. So it's the same basic premise. Start small, move on to bigger blocks of things, and before you know, you can plug things together. And that's sort of the basis of how they get to where they are, to where we are tonight, right? I would say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and with Azure Functions and automation, for that matter too, you can use that. It's a serverless environment to run code, so you can access it with webhooks, and so you can send data in and get data back. And then with different pricing options, the consumption, which is what we'll use here, is based on the amount of time it's used, which is really the cheapest option.
So it's funny, I find a lot of people starting out get intimidated by Azure or AWS, right? The cloud. But I always remember back in the days before cloud was very prevalent, like everybody was trying to build their lab. Oh, I got to get more gear. I need more gear to make my lab, right? If I only had more gear, I could do this. That all goes away now. You can kind of spin up whatever you want and throw it away as soon as you're done with it. Once you figure out the moving pieces, you don't have to necessarily spend $5,000 to build a lab because you need some fancy Cisco switch and you need all this stuff. You can build it, play around with it, and throw it away. So in some ways, Azure is almost easier to get started with than it was, 5-8 years ago when it was, I need to build a home lab.
Right, and that's one of the points I've made a few times in different videos and meetings is because a lot of people will say, well, Azure isn't free. You have to pay to run stuff in there, and that is true. You can get a Azure subscription with a credit, but that credit is only good for 30 days, and they do have some free options, but they're pretty low performance stuff. But the point I always make is there was a time when I had a stack of, 6-year-old computers that the company was throwing away, running domain controllers, and I had Cisco switches, and I had all this crazy stuff running, pulling power, generating heat. That's not cheap to run either. So having a lab in Azure really isn't that much more, especially if you're very careful on the different options. And the one thing that I'll throw out too, and I know all cloud providers have this, but you can set budgets and get alerts if you ever reach a point where you don't want to spend anymore. I would say if you're getting into cloud, get the subscription and figure out the budget and the alerts. Those are like the two steps.
Yeah, and I think it's come a long way in those fashions because it will also, automatically deprovision what is. And so I think a lot of people have been burned in the past. And so I think really the short answer that we're trying to also say is that if you're skeptical about getting started, is that.
Oh, we just lost Phil. All right, I'll take over since no one can hear him. So one of the things I wanted to mention was that the cost issue with Azure sometimes can be a misnomer. And that's because a lot of people that are coming to our meetings are usually infrastructure people, and a lot of infrastructure people start with, I need to set up VMs. VMs are typically can be expensive in the cloud, but there's many non-VM functions in the Azure cloud that are pennies to run at a time. One of our group leads, Jeremy Brown, has done a number of talks about services set up in the cloud, and his bill from Azure is usually like $2 a month. So I'm probably getting a little off topic here. I probably should let Travis get to what he wants to do, but don't be afraid to dip your toe into the Azure world. It's not as scary as you think. And maybe this is a good point to hand over to you, Travis, and let you do what you wanted to do tonight. So thank you for joining us. Looking forward to this, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'm Travis. I'm an infrastructure architect at RBA Consulting, located in a suburb of Minneapolis. I'm going to switch displays here. So let's see here. Like many of you, I'm working from home and loving it. I did come up with one downside today is I used to get a lot of Amazon packages delivered to work, and now I'm being held accountable for those packages. Anyway, I have a blog called Seraltos and a YouTube channel that covers a variety of Azure-related topics. I also authored a course, Zero to Hero with Azure Virtual Desktop on udemy.com. If anybody's interested, I can post a discount link to that at the end. I was going to create that beforehand, I forgot, but I can get that sent out. Just don't let me leave until I get one if you're interested. And I'm here to talk about Event Grid and Azure Functions with PowerShell. So these are two services in Azure that can be tied together to create some pretty cool custom automations. Let's start with Event Grid. Is everybody familiar with if this then that? If you're not, it's a service used with home automation or other platforms that lets you build recipes. So for example, if a sensor shows that a door is open at 9 p.m., it triggers an alert that the door was left open. I have a routine that will start my Azure lab using Alexa. I'll admit that I just did that because I could. There's really not a lot of use for it actually, but it is kind of a neat experiment. anyways, that's kind of what Event Grid does, only within Azure. If an event happens in Azure, then do something. More specifically, Event Grid is an event-driven publish subscriber model service. Events send notifications to subscribers when state changes. It's an alternative to a polling type service that checks the state every so often. Because it's not constantly polling, it can be cheaper. Let's see here. Excuse me for a second. I just have to, there we go.
So Travis, I just wanted to ask you, so Event Grid, I'm very familiar with if this then that. So Event Grid is for things that happen in the Azure cloud, but I would assume it also has tie-ins to third-party apps that are tied into Event Grid. So if something happens in Salesforce, do this. Is it that tied?
There are custom event, I'm forgetting the publishers that you can write.
Okay, but the idea is it takes data in and then you can do something with that data.
Mm-hmm.
I gotcha.
Correct. So it doesn't deliver data, only a message or information about the data. For example, if an event is fired when a file is uploaded to a blob container, the event message will have information about the file, but not the file itself. Okay, so let's see here. So Event Grid is broken down into three components: event sources, event grid, and then event handlers. So the event source is the if-then part of the if this then that. It triggers an event that gets passed to an event handler, the then that part. And my if this then and that analogy is done now, I'm pretty sure. So next we'll talk about event sources. So there are several built into Azure, including blob storage, Azure subscriptions, resource groups, policies, and so on. There's also a custom event option. With this, you can create your own source. An event source will send data to Event Grid when the event is triggered. The data sent is dependent on the source. So an Azure subscription event will have different data than, say, an Azure app configuration trigger. So that brings us to event handlers. There are several options available, including storage queues, event hubs, and logic apps. In this session, we're going over Azure Function event handlers for a couple reasons. First, it integrates natively with Event Grid. We just point Event Grid at the Azure function and we're good to go. Second, Azure Functions support PowerShell, one of the main reasons I'm here. That's the only language I know, and I wouldn't be talking about it if it required another language. Although Azure Functions do support other languages. I did a VB.NET course a long time ago in school. I had to build a calculator and I could never get it to divide. So that was my most experience with actual application development. Anyway, Azure Functions are pretty awesome. And I clicked too soon here. Azure Functions are pretty awesome. I use both Azure Automations and Functions. There are some limitations or similarities and differences, and I'm just going to go on a short tangent about them because I think it might be useful. One of the first reasons I use Azure Functions over Azure Automation is the minimum runtime for a schedule. With Azure Automation, it's 1 hour. Azure Functions can be triggered down to the second. But we're talking about Event Grid functions today, so scheduling reoccurrences doesn't really matter, but it's good to know if you plan on doing anything else. Also, Azure Functions use PowerShell 7, where Azure Automation uses PowerShell 5. I wrote a start-stop script about a year ago that would shut down or start Windows Virtual Desktop session host based on the user load. And at the time, the modules would only work on PowerShell 5, but I needed it to run every 5 minutes. So I had to do the actual action in Azure Automation, and then I created a function that would run every 5 minutes to trigger that by a webhook. So these can be tied together. But another difference is that Azure Functions support managed identities. A managed identity is a service principal used by the application to interact with resources in the tenant. A system-assigned managed identity lifecycle has a lifecycle bound to the function. So if you delete your Azure function, that managed identity goes with it. This is great just to keep things clean. Sometimes identities can be set up or service principals are set up, and then the actual application may go away, but that principal still hangs out. Azure Automation uses run as accounts. These are tied to a certificate that need to be renewed every year. And I can't tell you how many times I've had expired certificates become an issue in my career in IT. The good news is that managed identity support for Azure Automation is now in public preview. Anyway, getting back to the task at hand and moving on to Azure Grid Topics. An event grid topic is an endpoint where a source sends related events. It's where event handlers subscribe to. It's a message brokering that sits between that source and the handler. Let's see here. So why use Event Grid? We could, in theory, send data directly to a Azure function by a webhook, but Event Grid provides an event-driven architecture. More than one handler can subscribe to an event. It also has retries in it, allowing for multifaceted automation. For example, when a file arrives in blob storage, there could be a function that compresses and copies the file, while a logic app or another function updates the database with the file metadata. The main reason I use Event Grid is because of the native event source available in Azure. And then I'm just going to cover Azure Functions as well. For those not familiar with Azure Functions, an Azure Function is a serverless runtime in Azure. It supports multiple languages, and there are a couple SKUs available, including a shared consumption plan, a premium plan that provides higher CPU, SLAs, and virtual network integration, and a dedicated plan with a dedicated host and more features. Azure Function is the event handler we'll use to run the PowerShell code. Okay, here's the problem this demo is trying to solve coming up. Have you ever found resources in a subscription and had no idea if they were in use, who created them, or how old they were? I've seen this issue in some labs and possibly in some production environments. People set things up, use them for a while, and forget about them or move on or whatever. And this typically happens in especially newer environments where there's not a lot of governance around what's created. There is no metadata in Azure that includes who created the resource or how old it is, or at least I have not been able to find any. We can't find this once the resource is deployed, so even something like an Azure policy to tag a resource won't offer much help. Let's see here. But the information is available when the resource is created, and we can use the subscription as the source for Event Grid and pass that information to an Azure function as a handler, and from there apply a tag with the username and date. We're going to start this demo by creating a PowerShell function app. It's easier if the function app is in place before we configure the event source. An important step in deploying automation with Event Grid is to see the data that's passed in from the event source. We're going to configure the event source next and review the data passed in. After that, we'll configure the event source and functions to automatically tag a new resource group with the username and creator date. So let's move on. Okay. Can I just verify you can see the portal?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So here we are in the portal, and I'm going to go to Function Apps. We're going to start by creating a new function app. I'll create a new resource group. I'll keep everything nice and tidy, and then I'll give it a name. We'll just call this demo function. Let's see, demo. Give it a name. I'm going to put an 01 on there. And then we select the publisher. So we're going to use code. The runtime stack will be PowerShell core. Here are the other options, though, if there's something else that interests you, but I'm going to use PowerShell core. The version is 7, and the region, I'll stick to Central US. And so I'm creating a new function app, but you could do this also if you have an existing PowerShell function app. So a function app can have multiple functions. This one, I'm just going to do one function on one function app. Under hosting, I'm going to create a new storage account, and the plan type will be consumption, but here's where you can change the tier. Under monitoring, I'll leave it as application insight. I'll create a new one. If you have an existing application insight environment, you can select that as well. Tags, I'm going to leave that kind of ironically for what I'm doing, but so we'll create. Okay, this is just going to take a minute to finish. And I would like to point out that the basic setup here is for any Azure PowerShell function. You could use the same steps if you were deploying a function without Event Grid. Also, I did a video that demos this a while ago, so if you want to follow along later, or that is available on my YouTube channel. Are there any questions that came up while we're waiting for this?
So effectively, at this point, the idea that the Azure function is just going to be like this, call it portal repository of just a piece of code, and then you're going to then use some other function to actually just call that code remotely.
Yep.
Or from
yeah, the event grid is going to trigger it. It's going to pass in data that we can consume as a I forget what it is. I want to say a hash table, but it's not. It's a PS custom object. I can't remember now, but we can just use the data that's sent to it, and I'll demonstrate that as well.
Okay.
Okay, so that's finished. We're going to configure the function Appnet. So I'll go to resource. A couple things we have to take care of. First, under app files, we need to enable the AZ module, and that's located under requirements. And I'm going to take out the comment. So what this will do now is it tells the function, Azure function, to load the AZ module, the latest version of 6. And I'm going to actually change this to 5. It's kind of an experiment. I know 5 will work, but I've done this, walked through this a few times, and it hits a point where it tries to load the AZ module and it times out. And so I'm hoping if I switch it to 5, that doesn't happen. But you could add other modules in here if you wanted to. I could specify a specific version of 5 if that was a dependent on my code. So I'll save. Once that's done, I will go to overview. I'm going to restart that. So this is like rebooting the environment. It's just going to load in now that AZ module.
So while we're waiting for that, there was a question in chat about the difference between Azure, or excuse me, function apps different from modules. Is that correct?
Function apps different from modules.
Both seem to handle building multiple functions into named entities. Just curious how that works. Or
do you mean like using modules and function apps?
So I would guess from where Phil was going with that is a function app can be a block of code, or it could be a group of functions, right? Rolling up a bunch of functions into one sort of piece of one app that can trigger them all. That's in some ways, in some respects, is almost like a module. A module is a group of functions. But I think the difference here is that I don't think a module is ever meant to run all the functions at once, whereas a function app is going to say, execute the functions in this function app, if I understand correctly. Am I
Yeah,
kind of on point here?
it's running like a script is what the way I interpret it is. It's going to run an entire script or an entire list of code. And if you wanted to embed modules in there, you could, but that does bring up a good point is like, can you use, what happens if you have modules that you want to use? How do you import them in? I can't answer that question, but it's a good one.
But the important
So in
point,
that fashion, the function app is basically just like calling a script, but in a serverless mode. And so there's going to be some inputs, there's going to be some outputs, and so but it's basically you're going to call this block of code raw.
Right.
You're not going to, hey, it's not going to contain a bunch of stuff. You're going to pass parameters. You could do some funky stuff like that, but it's not really what it's designed to do. Correct?
Yeah, you can pass parameters into it. You can do it through like, I've done it with JSON, typically payload in a webhook, and then that can return data too that you can consume outside of the function app.
Okay, I think we're good. Yeah, so there's some people are in the chat are thinking more of like run books versus the function just being the discrete entities within a run book, right?
Right. So a function app is a collection. It can be a collection of functions. And I would say if you're familiar with Azure Automation, a function may be more analogous to a runbook, where it's a block of code or a script that will run when triggered.
it almost feels like a controller script.
So I might be able to provide some insight. I'm a cloud solution architect for Microsoft, so this is literally my job. So function apps are a container with which you run code. It can be PowerShell, it can be Node.js, it can be Python, but basically they are there to do one simple thing. You run the code, you provide the output, and you turn off again. They're a container or a resource rather than a module that has code. You can hook up multiple function apps to act like modules, so you can call one function app to another function app. That's not a good practice because your original function app will sit there waiting for the second function app to spin up, do its thing, and then return the result. But you can do that.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, thank you.
Thing I was going to add to that. Basically, one other big difference between functions and Azure Automation is the time limit. I mean, yes, you have advantages to the schedule. You could, theoretically go as little as every 7 seconds starting an Azure function. The problem is you have a limit of like 5 minutes. I think it might be extendable to 10 before your job has to finish or it gets cut off.
And you get around that by using Azure Automation instead.
Well, that's what I did because I had a gigantic job for what I was trying to accomplish. But I think what you would do here is, I don't know that it would be like you said. If you have a function calling other functions and you're waiting for a result, that's a problem. The timer never stopped on the original parent function. But if you had some way to orchestrate that, where you're calling another function with a rev trigger and you're not waiting on a result, you're passing down to the next function in the chain, that would be a little different. I've never tried that.
And that's an architectural design decision at that point. Like function apps
Like a
are designed
logic
to be
app
very small, very bite-sized. Get this simple input, provide this simple output, and do nothing else. It is meant to be very good at doing one exact thing and only that thing, such as tagging resources.
If you wanted to chain them, the best approach that I've seen is using logic apps.
Yes, definitely.
To manage it. Yep.
Interesting. Great. That's good information. Thank you.
All right, I'll shut up now.
Okay, let's see here. We enabled the AZ module. I think the next step was create the managed identity. So we'll go to identity, and I'm going to turn it on, and then click save. And yes, so this is going to create a security principal, a managed identity in Azure AD. Once it's done, we'll go into role assignments, and we'll add an assignment. The scope is going to be the subscription, so this will be able to interact with the entire subscription. For the role, I'm going to give it the tag contributor. So now it has the ability to modify tags on anything in the subscription. And let's see here. It does take a while for this to refresh. Just so if you come back later, it will show, but it did take, it did take effect.
So Travis, good question came in chat, which is, so I think you're going through this as a demo to show people with the GUI, but most of this stuff can be replicated through code, or you kind of forced to go through the interface, the GUI interface here for configuration of this part.
I haven't dealt with code to do this, but yes, I mean, if it's either through PowerShell or, you know, a JSON template, there's definitely other options.
This entire process is achievable via ARM template, PowerShell, Azure CLI, the whole works.
Yeah, there's a lot of
The stuff
options.
that's marked preview might not be fully functional or available in certain languages, but it will be there.
Yeah. So to elaborate on that a little bit more, the code we're going to run is PowerShell. I do like doing the demos with the GUI because I think it's, I don't know, it's easier for me to comprehend the first time. So, but yeah, that is an option. So a system assigned managed identity, I mentioned this before, that's tied to this function app. A user assigned identity is not tied to a specific function app. So a user assigned identity is good for a many-to-one type relationship. So if I had an Azure web app and I needed multiple functions to interact with that, I could make one user assigned managed identity that has access to that web app and then use that with the multiple functions. So we wouldn't have to create new system assigned managed identities for each one. I think I'm done with that. Okay, so now this function will have permission to manage tag in the subscriptions or the function app. And that is one thing I want to point out at this point. This entire function app and all the functions on it have the ability to the tag contributor role, and they also have the AZ module installed. If you had, for this it's fine, but if you're designing something where you're doing more security sensitive interactions, you wouldn't want to have multiple functions running with the same permissions in the subscription. Okay, so now I'm going to create the actual function. And we will go to create. And I'll use an, let's see, event grid trigger. And then we can also give it a new name. I'm going to leave it as event grid trigger, but there are other as well. There's a timer trigger in here, and there's a whole bunch of different options. We'll hit create. And then I'll go to code and test. So once this triggers, the way it's set up right now, event grid will pass in the data that includes the username and the resource group URI. And we need to see that data to understand how to use it as variables for the script I'm going to update this with. So the way it is now, it's doing an out string, and what I'm going to do is modify this. Oops. I just did my control V and control C's get mixed up sometimes. So we'll save, and then it's going to open up the log. Okay, so here's what I'm doing. And there may actually be a better way to do this, but it made sense to me. I need to be able to identify those values that get passed in to the function app when it runs. This code outputs the data as JSON. I can then copy that into a file in VS Code and view it in a format that makes sense. so the first time I run it, it's going to just output the code. Okay, so now it's time to enable Event Grid. So we've got the basis here of the Azure function setup, and I'm going to configure Event Grid on the subscription, because remember, we want to be able to trigger this every time a new resource is created in the subscription. If I can find subscriptions, there they are. Event Grid is located in Events. I'm going to enable Event Subscription. I'll give it a name. We'll use the Event Grid schema. Still loading. This is new. There we go. I don't know why it's slow. I've never seen this before. So the topic details, here's the topic. And you may have to fill in topic name the first time you run this. So under the event types, there's a lot of types we can fire this event on. So all we want, though, is when a new resource group is created. So that's a write success. We don't want to trigger when a write fails or a resource group is deleted, just the write success. So we're going to narrow down what's sent by unselecting everything but that write success. And then for the endpoint, we'll go to Azure Function, and then we'll select that endpoint, which is in the resource group. Which one was it? I think this one. I don't think that's it. Anybody remember what I named that?
Was it app demo?
I'm looking, I've got my notes here.
Function at demo?
Something, something, one.
Demo auto tag.
Event trigger one.
Demo auto tag 1.
Demo auto tag, that's what it was. Okay. So it's gonna find, I only have one function app in there, so it's gonna find it. And then we'll confirm the selection. And then I'm gonna go to filters next. Let's see here. Okay. So as the event sits now, every time any resource is created, the event will trigger. We need to filter this to only trigger on new resource groups. So we're adding a filter, and we're going to add the following information. The key is data.authorization.action. Write success or string contains. There, sorry. And then the value is Microsoft.resources/subscription/resource group/write. Now you're probably wondering where I got this from. This information is available in the data that gets passed into the function app, which is kind of a chicken and the egg scenario. So what I did is I initially created this without a filter, created a resource group, and I was able to see what unique identifying data was in there. And that's what I based this key and value pair off from. And I'll show you where I found that. But this will now filter down to just resource group rights.
So Jason sort of beat me to it, and I know you kind of answered this question already, but I was thinking, like, for someone who's sort of new to this, when they see you punch in a key field in the operator and the value and stuff, they're probably like, how the hell did he figure that out, right? So you don't have to necessarily say, hey, you found that particular data, but maybe when you hit some of these things, maybe you can give some pointers like how you figured out where, like you just did, how this is how I kind of got the data for this, because I just know there's probably a lot of people that are sort of new to Azure that they're like, what are all these drop downs? I don't understand what they are. I'll just do what he says, but they don't understand the meaning of the choices in them. So like when you did the key, I was like, I would not know where to find that one.
Right. Yeah. And for me, I think there might be a document, I'm sure it's documented someplace, but for me, what I did is I created everything except the filter. So I left this off. This is the first time I did it. And I created a new resource group, and I'll show you where I found it in a couple steps here. But basically I found, okay, here's the key and here's the value that will only occur when a new resource group is created. So that's where I got this.
Mm-hmm.
And I did include this. I've got code for this available on my GitHub repository. I included this specific information in there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I'll create, and now we've got the filter. Just as a side note, I have had a couple people use this and set it up without that filter. So it will add those tags to everything that's created in their subscription, which is a way to do it too. Okay, so now that we have the event trigger set up, and we've also got the function that's not going to tag anything yet, but it's going to output the data. Now let's create a resource group and see what happens. And I'll do that here. So I'll just issue a new resource group that's created. I'm also going to delete it because this is a test resource group. I don't need it. Now, we'll go back here. We'll go back to my function app. Go into my functions. We'll open that back up. And I'm going to, oops. No, I need to go into code and test. So this is the code. And what I'm looking for is the logs. So this is going to output the logs. Now, the first time it runs, it's going to download that AZ module, and it will take a minute. I had a couple instances where I needed to create a resource group the second time for the data to show. And also, I've had a couple instances over the past few times that I've tried this where it takes a lot longer than just a couple minutes. So if that happens, I'm going to jump over to a working code set, and we're kind of shuffle back and forth, and I'll explain what I'm doing, but we'll just give this a second. Is there any questions while we're waiting?
So just to back up, did you write the code to pull down AZ, or is that just a function of the function app? It's going to pull it down automatically.
That line of code is when you create a new function, it's available. What I had to do is uncomment it. It's kind of interesting. A while ago, it used to come uncommented, but it's commented now.
I was just wondering if you could substitute that with like the specific modules of AZ that you need, since it's such a monster of a module.
Oh yeah, I haven't tried that, but I would kind of assume that you could do that.
Mm-hmm. I only know that because I've made the same mistake. I installed the AZ module at work, and I'm like, what am I doing? I don't need 90% of this.
Mm-hmm. Here it's executing, so we should see a message. Oh, good, it worked. So it's interesting because I did this earlier today, and I left the 6 dot asterisk in, and it will work eventually, but you just have to give it time to download that module and install it. But switching it to 5, it could be a coincidence, or there could be something to it. But what I'm pointing out here is here we have information, and from this curly bracket, if we go all the way down to this last curly bracket, and you can see the next line, it starts with a date and information. So that's the next line of output. So this is all JSON code. I'm going to copy that, and I'll go back to VS Code. I'll paste it in. And then I'm going to do Control-Shift-P and format the document. Because it's an event grid .json file, VS Code knows how to process it. So the first thing I'll do, and all I'm doing at this point is I'm just looking at this data. This is a reference because when we go to pull data later, we need to know what the key is and where we find that value we need. Let's see here. So the first thing is if we go to, let's see here, data. So in the JSON code, we'll start with data, and then we'll go to authorization and action. So data.authorization.action, here's that resource group right. So if you wanted to do this for servers, you could go and find this, and it would give you the output for when a new server is created. So that's how I found that key value pair we referenced earlier in the event grid. We need two pieces of information, though, in order to tag values with a creator name in the function. The first is the name. So if we go to data, claims, and name. There's my name. So now we can reference data dot, let's see where it will, sorry, I lost my place here. Data dot claims dot name to get the value of whoever created this. And the next thing we need is the resource URI, so we know what to tag. And if we go to data, resource, let's see, under data resource URI. There it is. So that is the URI of the resource group that we're going to tag. So that will give us that data. So the event grid is passing in the data of who created it, what the resource was, along with a lot of other information. Okay, so we got that. That's where we find the information we need. I'm going to copy this code, and this code is available on my GitHub page. And then we'll go back to Azure Functions. I'll collapse that, and I'm just going to remove that and paste it in. So I've got, I'll just walk through this code quick. I've got the description and outputs and all that good stuff, disclaimers. Here is the filter information. I said that we have that available, or I have that available in the code. Okay, so we were going to pull in the parameter of the event grid event. That's the data we were just looking at that I output to JSON. So the next is we get the date, which is just today's date in the date format. I'm going to grab the name value, and that's the event grid event.data.claims.name. So that's going to give me, from the data passed in, the name of the person who created it. Now that I have both the date and the name, I create a hash table with the creator and then the creator name and the date created and the date. I also have some write outputs here that will just write out that information so we can see it for troubleshooting. Then we have the resource group URI, which is, again, from that data that's passed in, event grid event.data.resource URI. And at the end, it's just a simple try catch block that uses update AZ tag. We give it the resource group ID, the tag, and the tag hash table, and then the merge and a stop, error action stop. So when I first did this, I was using things like new AZ tag, or I cannot remember the exact command, but whatever it was, it would strip away any existing tags. So this command will just add to any tags that are there. So we'll save. And we'll come back down over to VS Code. I'm going to create a new resource group. You can see there's no tag here. Let me just do another So no tags. I'm going to give this will take a minute. One thing I will point out is this is not an instantaneous thing. It does take a little bit for it to, for the information to get passed along, but we should see it here in a minute or so. I was talking to somebody earlier about this specific use case, and I know that tagging a resource group may not be the most riveting use case, but it is helpful to understand this whole process to make other automations with Event Grid, or even if you're just interested in learning more about Azure Functions. Does anybody have any questions while we're waiting?
So you're using this, and there's an important point you just brought up there. You're not using this for event that needs to fire and get output immediately. You're saying this is going to run. It's going to take a little while to pass the data down. So in the case that you have here, we're looking to tag resources after they're deployed. If that gets deployed 5 minutes after it's deployed, if that's get tagged 5 minutes after deployed, no harm, no foul here. It's not something where this event happens and I need the result of that immediately. There is a lag. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Could you give a really brief, what is the benefit or the end result of tagging these events? I understand what tags are in the general scheme of things, but okay, in Azure, in this context, why are we tagging?
So under this context, the use case that I actually ran into this, especially in lab environments where there are a lot of people coming in, there might not be a lot of governance over it. Resources are spun up, and later on somebody will come in and try to understand who did it, how old is it, and that information isn't metadata within the object. So this is just creating tags that will attach that resource. So we can say, oh, Travis Roberts created this on August 4th. So you have some understanding of who did it. Also, like I just alluded to, it's also an experiment on how to get Event Grid to work with Azure Functions.
So Mark, the takeaway here is that he saw a need, right? People deploying stuff in Azure, and then people move on, and then sort of that tribal knowledge leaves with the person. Then all of a sudden, someone goes, I don't know why this was deployed or who deployed it. This is something that's not available in Azure out of the box to tag every piece of data. So he's come up with an interesting solution to be able to take data that's available from another tool in Azure and be able to tag resources as it being created in Azure, so that going forward, you have a history stamp, basically a timestamp on everything, a history stamp of this resource was created by this person via this tag that he's creating.
Got it. And a tag once created is attached to that particular event for enhancing the data or metadata of that event. Yes?
Well, I think the tag is the metadata that he's attaching to the object or the resource or that old, the identity of the thing. And so he's using Event Grid to actually apply those tags where appropriate. And so in this fashion, because of the date created and all that kind of stuff, it's not inherently into that metadata. He's injecting that metadata on the fly and using Event Grid to do that work.
The metadata that comes with the event, or excuse me, that comes with the object doesn't include what he really needs from a going forward longevity historical analysis.
Correct.
Right.
So
okay.
So we could think of it in other forms as, like, hey, if you're doing some other work and you have some other automation, so, hey, it's a ServiceNow thing, and hey, who's the creator and what is it tied to and other kind of thing. So this is the creator, but hey, I want to assign it to a business group that's not in Azure and Event. Hey, I want to tag it with some other thing or some internal, stuff or anything or any other some other stuff. is we're just tagging it. Granted, at this point, we're just tagging, but you could do any effective function at that point. And so you can use this and go kick off other scripts somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah, and something else you can do with this is if everything has tags by the name, if somebody leaves an organization, you could then query all the resource tags to try to identify all the resources that they created. So that information wouldn't be there within the object metadata.
I find the interesting thing about it is once you put forth this idea of we're going to create some automation to tag resources as they get created, it sounds like something that should just be there and you shouldn't have to build on your own. It sounds like, oh my God, what a great idea. Why didn't someone think of that earlier? It's such a natural use case. Everybody has an environment where they're like, I don't know who the hell built this crap or why, right? It just seems like such an obvious thing.
So there actually is that automation there out of the box in Azure. It's using Azure policy. There are default policies that allow you to enforce tagging upon resources of any type.
See, I looked into that, and what I found is that happens after the resource is created, and so you can tag it, but this information, like the creator who did it, isn't available at that point.
Yeah, it is. I've done that myself in several organizations now.
Interesting.
Yeah, an owner tag. Also, I mean, you can also do things like tag inheritance. So usually an owner of a system would have their own subscription, and you can say, okay, all resources in this subscription inherit the owner tag from that subscription.
So that would be like the owner.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if there was a contributor who created it, would it then inherit the owner?
Well, if there was a contributor, yes, but in the kind of spaces I work in, you don't have contributors. Everything is deployed by CI/CD.
Yeah,
and
that is,
code.
that's
so there are the person who created it is the same service account that created every single other resource in this entire subscription.
Yeah, you hit upon one of the limitations of this. If automation is creating resources, it will pass in whatever identity created it. So if it's a managed identity, it won't be the user who kicked off the automation or the automation. It'll be the security principal that created it. So, but we're getting far away. This is all good information. I want to get back though because it did finish, and we can pick this up for sure because it's all good information. And if we go back to here, now you can see that was the get the resource. Now if we get the resource, we have the tag value of the creator and the name. And that is it. I'm just looking at my notes here. Are there any other questions now that that's finished?
So is the tag viewable in the GUI when I look at the resource now? Yeah. Can I see that?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. I think that just
remember the
brings it all together.
Let's see here. If I can remember the resource group name this time, it was demo
auto tag
1. That's the thing I love about standards is there's so many to choose from. So there's the creator name and the date.
Ah, that is cool. But I also like what Phil was saying about you can assign things that maybe aren't so obvious, like a business group or other maybe business-oriented information, not just user stuff.
Well, I think in that same fashion, it's also the idea that, you know, you can use the same principle, and he created this code that set tags, but effectively you could use the same idea and based upon some event use, you know, Azure Functions and these events to actually kick off other things to do and, you know, process it effectively. It's that whole if this then that kind of thing. So with that functionality, you can do effectively anything. He's actually doing some work with, you know, tags, but screw the tags kind of thing. You can do other things. You can then kick off emails and do that kind of stuff. So it's
Right.
there probably is, you know, like I've been talking about the idea that there is some other kind of stuff built in because hey, it is. But if it's not doing exactly what you're looking for, well, even into Travis's point, like, well, he didn't know it can do exactly that, or it's not the exact use case he's looking for. Well, boom, you got the ability to do it you're exactly the way you want it.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different event sources baked into Azure, and then handlers. You can use a function, but you can go to logic apps if you're more comfortable with that. One of the ideas I had, and I just couldn't put it together, was every time an image is uploaded to blob storage, compress it. You know, that's the type of thing where you could do that with this solution. Somebody could do that. I can't. There's an issue with the compressing images that was just too involved for me. But you could add that data to database if you're tracking images.
Well, certainly cool. I can certainly see some value in the idea that being able to just kick off your own functions at that point and then just do whatever you want. Now, granted, you know, there may be some out of the box stuff to do, but having the ability to write your own code or even, you know, process code, it just gives you the world's your oyster.
So I see there's a bunch of people chiming in how they've done some form of what Travis was showing tonight, but like Andy was saying, oh, you are using a cleaner date than what I was using, or another person said I didn't realize you can get the owner info. So this is one of those things where maybe we're not reinventing the wheel here with something amazingly new, but it's more about opening up your ideas, opening up your mind to different ideas of what can be done, the possibilities here. So thank you so much for sharing this tonight. It's really interesting to see how this all fits together.
You're welcome. I was glad to share this.
Yeah. So as Phil was saying here, we have a few minutes here. If anybody wants to chime in and get some questions for Travis, feel free to do so. We can just keep chatting in the chat. If there's something that you didn't understand from the presentation, we'll wrap this up here in a few minutes.
I got a question. You don't mind?
Not allowed.
Go ahead.
No, you're not allowed to ask questions. No. Kidding.
Okay. So I asked this earlier and I might have missed it because I was getting distracted here, but this is a fantastic session from everybody. All the comments going back and forth has been like really filling in a lot of gaps for me. Question I have is on the event handler side. So I see the event sources there and I was curious. So I have try to keep it short. We have a runbook based process, Azure Automation, that automates a user lifecycle process for a place I work with. And it's driven off of XML files that get dropped out of their HR system. And we were using watchers, but watchers became pretty crappy and unreliable. And everything we got from Azure support was quit using them because their life is going to end. So we went to rolling schedules, which is a way to get around the hourly limit. You just create a cascade of schedules that run every hour, but with an offset, so you can mimic, you know, for every 50 this kind of thing. Can you use the event grid with a log analytics agent to monitor events that come from a hybrid worker, or is that something you have to do from the log analytics workspace side?
So There is a hybrid worker for Azure Functions, so you can run code on premises or within your environment. But tying it into log analytics, I'm not quite sure how that would.
Okay, so you still could trigger a function from that, from the agent? Is it a separate agent or the same agent?
Oh, you know, I know what you're saying now. Okay, yeah, because that OMS agent, it got deployed, but it wasn't like a it was like a hidden agent. I know it's been a while since I worked with that. Yeah, there is a way to run hybrid workers. To be honest with you, though, I can't remember the specifics of it, but I did a video on it a while ago. So I do have content out there. It's been a long time, and I can't remember what that worker was on premises. There was a data gateway or some gateway service, but it works the same. It establishes that outbound connection over 443, and that opens up that bus that communicates back and forth, so you don't have to poke holes in your firewall. Watcher task, though, I don't remember seeing anything like a watcher task, but you can schedule it, more frequently.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'd just like to add the tagging is a good thing for budgeting.
Yes.
A lot of people, they're trying to figure out who's spending the most in the tenants. This is a great solution right here.
Yeah, being able to filter cost on tags is a really handy way to identify. Especially, I've seen some environments, especially smaller ones, where it's like one subscription. A lot of people, then they use resource groups to kind of spread out the load, where some bigger organizations or just other organizations use more subscriptions, so you can roll up cost to that by like a product group or a group within the organization. But yeah, if you have multiple resource groups or multiple subscriptions where it all rolls up, being able to combine that data by tags is really helpful. Is my camera on, or are you still looking at the event handler page?
Event handlers page.
Event
I think your OBS.
I don't know how to turn on my camera. I stopped sharing.
Yeah, I saw that. I think that was the problem we had before. Your OBS is still showing you're presenting. That's your camera. There you go.
There you
Now
go.
we're looking at some sheet of paper
On a couch.
Let's see.
or couch. Well, I think certainly just have a conversation now, and there've been some great questions, and chat has definitely been lively tonight, and so really appreciate everybody for asking such great questions, and appreciate Travis for being open to sharing what he's done, and thanks to the community itself. Do you want to add anything, Mike? And I think we can probably wrap this up.
I guess I just really want to say thank you to Travis for spending time with us. This was a lot of fun tonight. I like sessions like this because, first of all, when I watch them, I don't understand every piece of it because I'm not doing this stuff every day. But these are the kind of sessions for me that fire off ideas, want to take me to find new things and new avenues in the Azure cloud to play with. And that's how I kind of describe our best sessions. It's like, they're not the sessions where, you know everything and every command that happened. You watch the demo and you go, wow, that was cool. I don't know everything that he did, but I'm going to go back and figure out how he did that. So these are the ones I love. The sessions like this will really kind of stretch the imagination a little bit. This was a good one. So with that, maybe we'll wrap this up. We'll say thank you to Travis for spending time with us tonight. If you're watching this at home, our YouTube channel has about 100 other videos of sessions just like this. We invite you to take a look at the channel. We'll present some cards to you that you can take a look at, some videos that you might be interested. Thanks so much for joining us, and good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Travis.
Thank you.